Hi, I'm Catherine Wood, Mental Fitness Coach at Life Renewal. Thank you for joining me today for this webinar. So today we're going to be talking about 3 evidence-based techniques to experience less stress. Let's get going. So before I move on, I'll just give a brief introduction about my coaching. So I combine my coaching expertise with neuroscience. So neuroscience is about understanding how our thinking drives our behaviors, which impacts how we feel. And I bring my expertise of coaching combined with neuroscience to enable my clients to experience sustainable and intentional change. I specialize in creating healthy habits using evidence-based tools and techniques for stress management and avoiding overwhelm. And I currently work with corporate leaders and employees in global organizations, as well as individuals, to experience a life of less stress and overwhelm. So why do I do this? When I was a child, I was diagnosed with psoriasis, which is a skin complaint. And I experienced a lot of daily stress and anxiety, which led to flare-ups of my psoriasis. When I became a coach, I wanted to learn how to reduce stress so that this would reduce the flare-ups I was having with my psoriasis, and understanding how we can change our thinking to drive behavior. This enabled me to understand what the techniques were to activate that prefrontal cortex, which is avoiding triggering the stress response, but instead activating a state of calm. And I'll be talking through this a little bit more in a moment. And what I use is a toolkit of evidence-based techniques which I can tap into whenever I experience that stress, or I think I'm going to feel stressed in a particular difficult situation. So there are various different techniques you can use to experience less stress and overwhelm. But today I'm going to just focus on the 3 evidence-based techniques that I use to reduce stress. So here we're going to dive into the science behind stress. How does the brain respond to stress? So here we have a visual to demonstrate the difference between the unstressed state and the stressed state in the brain. So there is a switch. You can only be activating the prefrontal cortex when the amygdala is deactivated, and vice versa. So the prefrontal cortex will enable you to experience tighter control of thoughts, emotions, and actions. And the evidence-based techniques that I'm going to talk to you today about, these will activate that prefrontal cortex. When you're stressed, the brain has activated the amygdala, and this is where you will experience weaker control of thoughts, emotions, and actions. And that's because of that fight or flight response, which is triggered. And what's happened is that in the stressed response, your brain has sensed a threat or perceived a threat during a difficult situation, compared to in the unstressed state, which is where you've managed to change that threat to a challenge. So using the evidence-based techniques, you've been able to switch on the prefrontal cortex, which automatically switches off the amygdala part of the brain, to give you clearer thinking, to give you the ability to choose how you want to respond to a difficult situation. The brain automatically activates the amygdala for the stress response during difficult situations. This is because the brain senses a threat or a perceived threat during difficult situations. And this is the outcome, the list of acute symptoms: physical, emotional, cognitive, and behavior symptoms. And you may notice that when you are experiencing stress and you have some of these symptoms, your thinking is switched off. This is because of the switch I was talking about earlier, when the brain has activated the amygdala, the stress response, and this has switched off that prefrontal cortex area of the brain that is responsible for clear thinking and planning and organizing and so on. So these strategies that I'm going to be talking about will activate that prefrontal cortex so you do not experience these symptoms of stress so much. It's going to actually mean that you experience less stress because you have activated the prefrontal cortex. If we continue to experience stress, this can become chronic stress. And here on this slide, we have the symptoms of chronic stress across the physical, emotional, and cognitive and behavior. And in the physical list, you will see there the skin diseases and impact on existing skin conditions such as psoriasis, which is what I was talking about earlier. So to avoid the stress becoming chronic stress, it's important that we can do something about it. It's important to know that we have the techniques and the tools to experience less stress so that our stress that we are experiencing doesn't become chronic stress. What are the symptoms of the fight or flight response? So the fight or flight response is when the amygdala is triggered, and this is because the brain has either sensed a threat or perceived a threat during a difficult situation. And these are the symptoms you may experience: sweating, nausea, butterflies in the stomach, rapid, shallow breathing, shaking, racing thoughts, difficulty paying attention and concentrating, dizziness and lightheadedness, and muscle tension. So noticing these symptoms that you may experience, you'll then be able to identify that you have activated that fight or flight response, and you'll know that you'll be unable to have a tight control on your thoughts, on your emotions, or on your actions. Here we're going to move on to the 3 evidence-based techniques to experience less stress. And this is going to avoid triggering that fight or flight response because it will be activating the prefrontal cortex. So all of these techniques will activate the prefrontal cortex to enable you to have tight control of your thoughts, emotions, and actions. So here we have the first technique, which is reframing your perception. So there's 3 points to this. The first point is noticing your thoughts. So during a difficult situation, write down what your thoughts are. Why are you thinking this? The second part is challenging your thoughts. What evidence do you have for your thought or against your thought? And then the third part is create a realistic alternative viewpoint. So looking at what you've written down, create a new way of looking at that particular difficult situation. And this will change the way that you respond to that difficult situation or during that difficult situation. So one of the examples I can give you where I've used this particular framework is when I lost my job back a few years ago in the corporate space. And I went through this framework. And initially I was frustrated. I was thinking, why me? Why has this happened? And then going through the framework, by the end, I'd come to a different viewpoint of thinking this was an opportunity to change what I was doing in terms of my career. So I returned back to piano teaching and I moved on from that particular situation. So the second technique is about increasing BDNF production. So what is BDNF? BDNF is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's a protein for learning and memory. And I first learnt about BDNF when I was studying for my certified resilience coaching practitioner training. And It's very important because the BDNF helps the brain to develop new connections, repair failing brain cells, and protect healthy brain cells. So it's the BDNF that really gives you that healthy brain throughout your life. BDNF protects our brains from neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And research tells us there is evidence to show BDNF has a role in regulating the stress response. So why wouldn't you want to increase BDNF production? And how do you do this? Well, I'll show you on the next slide. So how do you increase BDNF production? Well, it's across three key areas, which are quality sleep, nutritional food, and regular exercise. And it's about creating habits to drive behavior change. This is the only way that you will experience sustainable and intentional change. So with me, I created habits in these different areas, and this helped me to increase BDNF production. I experienced less stress because of the habits I'd created. So for nutritional food, for example, I created habits to ensure I was cooking 3 to 4 times a week at a minimal. And regular exercise. During COVID, I started doing home workouts, and I'd make sure I was doing 2 to 3 workouts a week. And once I saw the benefits and experienced the benefits of doing these things, this is where I started experiencing less stress and less overwhelm. So this is the third and final evidence-based technique I'll be covering today, which is the CIA framework. So I'll talk you through it. The first part is asking yourself, during a difficult situation, can I control this situation? If not, you can move on to the next question. Can I influence the situation? And if not, you can move on to the third point, which is I need to accept the situation. So this means there has to be a shift that takes place in your thoughts about that situation, so your perception of that situation. You can ask, how can I adapt to the situation? So what do you need to do to actually feel that you've overcome the situation or you've moved on from that situation, for example? Well, this is about focusing on what you can control, focusing on what I can control. So how have I used this CIA framework before? Well, I'll give you one example, which is after I'd been diagnosed with Hashimoto's and during my recovery process. Back then, I had a lot of irrational thoughts due to the Hashimoto's, which were pretty scary, and I felt very anxious for many months. And it took me maybe up to a year to actually feel that I could move on from what had happened. So in that situation, in that recovery stage, to enable myself to feel better, to actually adapt to what had happened, I used this framework. And it really helped me to shift my mindset, my thinking about what had happened to how I could adapt to that situation, to give me a sense of hope, to give me that rational thinking again of getting a different or creating a different viewpoint about how I felt about what had happened. And because there was that shift in my mindset of thinking, okay, well, this has happened. I can't influence or control the situation, but I can adapt to it. This is where I came out with a positive outcome of thinking, okay, well, I can still move on. I can still do the things I want to do. I can still be who I was meant to be without this situation impacting that. So we're almost at the end of this webinar, and there are key takeaways to experience less stress and overwhelm. First one is looking back at the first technique, reframe your perception by creating a realistic alternative viewpoint. So this is about looking at a difficult situation, noticing your thoughts, challenging your thoughts, and creating an alternative viewpoint with that new thought, and therefore enabling you to respond how you want to respond to that difficult situation. This is about activating that prefrontal cortex. The second key takeaway is increasing BDNF production by creating habits for sleep, nutrition, and exercise. So that's about looking at where you're at in those 3 areas right now and thinking, how can I better that? How can I create habits where I'm getting better sleep or more nutrition or more regular exercise? And then the third technique being using the CIA framework to focus on what you can control. And this is important to use on a regular basis, all of these techniques, to be able to then experience less stress and overwhelm by using these techniques in the moment to activate the prefrontal cortex, which will enable you to activate the unstressed state rather than automatically activating the amygdala, which will give you the fight or flight response, which is the stress response. I'll just tell you about my new app, which is called Think Less Stress, and it contains all the information and resources you need to experience a life of less stress and overwhelm. And it covers 11 topics, and right now I have a special offer of $35 until the 2nd of May 22, which will give you access to the first topic on stress management. So that's all for now, and thank you again for attending today's session. I'd like to invite you to join my Facebook group, which is called Prioritizing Your Wellbeing, and the link is there on the slide. And visit my website to learn more about mental fitness and the other products and services that I offer at liferenewal.com.au. Okay, thanks again. Bye.